Evidence exists that the Sun will likely lose a portion of its mass without the action of the primal fields when its inactive state begins. The external plasma pressure is thereby removed. At the present time, the planets orbit at a mere 71% of the velocity that a stable orbit requires. However, for the long glaciation periods with a lighter Sun, the present velocity would be just about right. This means that under present conditions, the Sun's gravitational attraction is 29% stronger than the centrifugal force of the planets in orbit. The resulting large difference is evidently compensated for by the electromagnetic effects of the primal fields that maintain the orbits electrically against the stronger gravity. Evidence suggests that the orbits of the planets are presently electromagnetically ordered. In a lab experiment, non-magnetic steel balls were laid on a sheet of glass. They were drawn into a specific orbit around the center of two bowl-shaped magnets. The steel balls seen here are magnetically self-spacing. If they are disturbed and let go, they return to their magnetically determined positions. The experiment illustrates to some degree how the orbits of the planets are likely magnetically assisted, so that the Sun's gravitational variation is not a big factor. However, during the long solar off times in the glacial period, when the primal fields no longer exist, or exist only during the short periods of the dense Scottish warming events, the Sun's gravity would be the sole factor for keeping the orbits intact, especially in the time when the Sun's gravity is changing. While this won't likely affect the orbits of the planets significantly, it appears to have a major effect on orbiting asteroids that are affected by cosmic drag because of their larger surface-to-mass ratio. The ice core data tells us that the loss of the primal fields has a far greater effect than we care to imagine. Near the end of each glacial period, large dust accumulations are found in the ice of Antarctica, which appear to have resulted from increased impacts of asteroids or asteroids disintegrating in the atmosphere. The dust always stops when the interglacial period begins, in which the primal fields are active again. The operation of the primal fields is evidently also responsible for the planets orbiting in a highly maintained ecliptic plane. No purely mechanical cause would organize the planets into an ecliptic plane. No mechanistic principle exists that would prevent the planets from orbiting the Sun in a random pattern, or force them to orbit at all. This means that the primal fields have a much larger effect and purpose than merely focusing plasma onto the Sun. A wider field of phenomena stands as evidence for the primal fields. The near geometrically expanding spacing of the orbits of the planets reflects the progressive spacing that one would expect to see between the node points of the heliospheric current sheet that becomes diffused by its expanding in geometric widening space. The geometrically expanding spacing of the orbits of the planets, too, adds another item of evidence for the operation and for the far-reaching effect of the primofields that power our Sun. Actually, we don't have to look quite as far for evidence. We have mechanical evidence for the operation of the primofields right here on Earth. The spin rotation of the Earth itself is evidently electrically powered by the effects of the primofields. If it wasn't for that, cosmic drag would have stopped the spinning of the Earth long ago. A further item of evidence that supports this recognition is found in the jet streams in the atmosphere that are extremely fast-moving air currents that flow in the direction of the Earth's rotation, but move significantly faster than the rotation of the Earth itself. It has been long believed that the jet streams are powered by the Coriolis effect of the air masses from the polar regions reversing direction in the warmer regions. However, in this case, the northern and southern jet streams would flow in opposite directions, which they don't. Another phenomenon on Earth where rotational movements occur faster than the rotation of the Earth are the massive ocean currents that flow in a circle around Antarctica. The currents shown here are a part of a worldwide cold water recycling system. Cold waters in the polar regions are so dense by contraction and salination that they sink into deep pools. The Arctic pool has an outflow that creates a deep current that flows all the way to Antarctica, where it joins the deep pool there that encircles the continent. With the encircling deep pool flowing faster than the rotation of the Earth, two currents spin off from the rotating pool. One flows to the coast of Africa, where the cold waters warm up and resurface. The second branch flows into the central Pacific, where it too warms up and resurfaces. With the cold, deep waters originating in the polar regions, they carry with them large volumes of dissolved CO2. Cold waters can dissolve CO2 up to a 10 times greater density than the density of it that the atmosphere presently holds. In this manner, dissolved CO2 can ride in a very slow-moving recycling system with a transit time of 350 years to 1,000 years or more, which is evidently electrically powered by rotational actions motivated by the primofields. This means that the actively powered recycling system emits CO2 into the atmosphere today that had been dissolved into the oceans during the extremely cold period of the late Little Ice Age. This also means that the large CO2 increase in modern time originated at the Little Ice Age 350 years ago, or in some other cold periods in more distant times, rather than being the product of human activity today. If one considers that a recycling system incorporates 3 different transit times, it is possible for CO2 to be released by the recycling system from 3 different historic times simultaneously. The transit time to the Indian Oceans is the shortest, possibly in the range of 350 years, with the island of Madagascar standing in the way. The transit time to the mid-Pacific, in turn, appears to be significantly longer, and for the CO2-rich waters from the Arctic in the north, the total transit time probably exceeds 1,000 years. The exact times are not known. Since the different transit times resurface CO2 from 3 different eras simultaneously, the large increase in CO2 that has been measured in recent times appears to be the result of overlapping recycling returns from 3 of the big cold periods of the last 1,200 years. This means that the big increase in CO2 that has occurred, which has invigorated the biological system, is a benefit provided for humanity by the electromagnetic effects of the primal fields that evidently power the recycling system by the rotation of the ocean currents around Antarctica at a speed greater than the rotation of the Earth. The increased CO2 is a benefit for us, for the simple reason that CO2 is critical for plant growth and thereby increases harvests. Of course, other factors also enter the consideration of the CO2 increase that direct measurements tell us of. One factor is that the increase in CO2 that is shown here has occurred during the time frame of the Great Global Warming, which has measurably resulted from the sharp increase in solar activity that has occurred during this time frame from the Maunder minimum on. The Great Global Warming that has recovered the global climate from the Little Ice Age was clearly the result of the sharp increase in solar activity that occurred after the Maunder minimum. The sharp increase in solar activity has been recorded in increased sunspot cycles and also in increased carbon-14 measurements, which measures solar cosmic ray flux. The resulting warm climate from increased solar activity would naturally increase the atmospheric CO2 density as less CO2 is being dissolved into the oceans during the warm periods. It is interesting to note that the measured 15% increase in CO2 from the 1950s on couldn't have originated from man-made contributions that at the peak of their increase amounted in total a mere 1% per year of the global CO2, while a quarter of the global CO2 gets recycled annually, with slightly half of that flowing through the ocean's recycling system. A 1% increase simply doesn't add up to that much. It is further interesting to note that the period from the 1950s on to slightly before 2000 was a peak period in solar activity and the warmest in hundreds of years, which should therefore coincide with a high rate of CO2 increase due to the warming. In addition, the sharp increase that the ice core data indicates has been disputed by a high-level expert in the field, Dr. Zbigniew Jaworowski, the one-time chairman of the Scientific Council of the Central Laboratory for Radiological Protection in Warsaw, has pointed out that ice core measurements have an inherent problem. His experience has been resulting from a 50-year career of ice exploration on 6 continents, that large losses of CO2 result in the period of snow becoming compacted, first into firn, then into deep hoar, and so on, until it becomes compressed into solid ice. With CO2 being highly soluble in water, a large portion of CO2 in the original snow becomes lost with the loss of water vapor that is expelled by the compaction process. His take is that the CO2 portion that is finally compressed into ice is significantly less than what was originally present. Dr. Jaworowski compared the CO2 concentrations in ice from the stage just past the firn to ice transition with CO2 concentrations of the same type in deep sediments, and reports that the CO2 level in the sediments hadn't significantly changed in this period. Dr. Jaworowski notes that the hockey stick phenomenon that has been deployed to scare humanity into economic suicide measures and depopulation is not actually true, but is simply a characteristic of the CO2 loss in the ice compaction process. He notes that the characteristic is known, but appears to be intentionally abused for political purposes. In this case, the primal fields even affect politics. Under political dogmas, the imagined CO2 increase in modern time is regarded as man-made and is deemed to be the sole cause for the great global warming that occurred after the Little Ice Age, when industrial activity began, which, as it is said, must be prevented with political will at all cost from further increasing. Not a word was ever spoken in these arenas that the global warming was demonstrably caused by the sun and was impelled by cosmic processes and resonating astrophysical conditions, while CO2 itself is not a climate factor at all in comparison. Nor was it ever noted in these politically driven operations that a hockey stick CO2 increase is an illusion caused by the false interpretation of the ice core data. Nor was it ever said that the actually physically measured increase in CO2 levels, which only goes back 50 years, coincides with the greatest peak in solar-caused global warming and coincides in addition with overlapping CO2 emissions from the historic high CO2 concentrations via the slow-moving global recycling system. Likewise, it was never said that CO2 isn't a climate factor anyway, as it contributes only a millionth part of the global greenhouse effect, which itself isn't the prime climate factor either, since the absolute prime factor is the rate of cloudiness that is affected by solar activity, which in turn is affected by astrophysical factors that flow through the primal fields. Since all these factors are known, the political will is falsely placed and evidently with intention, especially considering that it is known that CO2, which the man-made global warming dogma is centered on, is not a climate factor at all, never was, and never can be, as the claimed effects are physically impossible in the overall context. Nor was it ever said in the political brainwashing projects that include to a large degree also the media, that the great global warming that pulled us out of the little ice age was demonstrably and measurably a solar-forced cosmic phenomenon, instead of being man-made in any way. I have diverged into the CO2 subject because it is a part of the global recycling system, which is powered by astrophysical principles that cause air and sea movements on Earth that flow faster than the rotation of the Earth itself. The CO2 subject, of course, is far bigger than a mere academic concern. It affects your dinner table now with increasingly high food prices and raises the fuel prices for transportation and for heating your home. Under the banner of CO2-forced man-made global warming, the mandated mass burning of food for biofuels production has diverted huge agricultural resources to be burned that would have normally nourished 400 million people. In a world that has 1 billion people living in chronic starvation, the food-burning holocaust is claiming more than 100 million victims each year of deaths by starvation. This places the CO2 issue far out of the realm of mere academic concerns, into the political arena with the often stated objective of mass depopulation, that is, to weed out the useless eaters, as the victims were once called, to shrink the world population to less than 1 billion people. The academic issues, if they were widely understood, would block this politically forced tragedy for which no physical cause actually exists. In getting back to the phenomena of fluid movements that are faster than the rotational speed of an object under the primal fields, as we see it reflected in the jet streams and in the ocean current movements around Antarctica, one finds, of course, that the Earth is only a small part of the solar system, which means that the Earth is not alone in being so affected by the primal fields that cause fluid movements exceeding the spin axis rotational speed. The phenomenon is highly prominent on the Sun, though it is barely visible there. The phenomenon is discernible there by the differential movements of its features, such as sunspots. The Sun rotates significantly faster on the equator than on the poles. It takes the Sun 35 days for a single rotation at the poles, but only 25 days for a rotation at the equator. The faster equatorial rotation stands as evidence that the Sun is actively rotated by an external electric force, which in addition acts most strongly on its equatorial region from where its hemispheric current sheet extends. The Sun's two high-activity bands, space-centered off the equator, actually reflect in the large, what became evident in principle in plasma experiments. The evidence illustrates the functioning of the primal fields and their effects that we see evident in the form of an ecliptic ring of induced plasma currents, which we see in principle reflected on the Sun in the form of the equatorial high-activity zones. The ecliptic principle is also apparent to some degree in David LaPointe's static exploration of the primal fields. He points out that the resulting shape in his experiments is dramatically apparent in the ecliptic shape of the galaxies, which suggests a commonality of principle in both cases. The evidence that one sees here is of a solar system that is in all major aspects electrically powered and electrically motivated, and shares this principle with the galactic systems. This means that galaxies are not stable entities, but are subject to plasma density resonances in intergalactic space and intergalactic plasma streams that are focused by large primal fields onto the galaxies. For our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, two potential plasma streams to nearby galaxies come into view that may form the intergalactic node points. The potential resonance cycles for these very long intergalactic plasma streams appear to be reflected in long-term climate cycles on Earth. For our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, two potential plasma streams to nearby galaxies come into view that may form the intergalactic node points. The potential resonance cycles for these very long intergalactic plasma streams appear to be reflected in long-term climate cycles on Earth. This means that the solar system and the Earth are not fundamentally isolated entities, but are intimately connected, both physically and by the sharing of a common universal, all-motivating principle. This also means that the Sun is not its own master, but exists cradled between interstellar primal fields that give it its existence as an externally powered star. This further means that the primal fields can collapse when the external conditions fail that enable the primal fields to function. When this happens, our world will change. The phase shift in our world onto an inactive Sun, which could happen in 30 years, does not imply that the end is near for mankind. It means the opposite. It means that we find ourselves impelled to utilize the scientific, technological, economic, and cultural resources that we have developed and meet the impending phase shift in the solar system with an equally majestic phase shift of our own, by creating the greatest renaissance of all times in our time, against which the coming ice age has no sting for us. With this, we write ourselves a ticket to live, and to have a future, and to live abundantly.